Part 1, Sandy Hook Elementary School. The morning arrived wrapped in winter stillness. A small town moving through routine without urgency. Frost clung to lawns. School buses slowed at familiar corners. Children stepped down with backpacks bouncing lightly against their shoulders. Teachers stood at doorways repeating the same greetings they had spoken for years. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing hinted at rupture. It was the kind of morning that disappears into memory precisely because it feels safe. Inside the school, habits unfolded on autopilot. Coats were hung. Papers were stacked. Classrooms filled with quiet chatter and the soft scrape of chairs. Elementary schools carry a particular kind of innocence. They are built on trust. Doors open easily. Smiles come naturally. That trust hung in the air that morning, unaware it was about to be shattered. Adam Lanza existed far from that warmth. Outside observers often described him as silent, withdrawn, intensely private. He was intelligent, capable of deep focus, yet disconnected from those around him. Social interaction did not come easily. He avoided crowds. He retreated from eye contact. His presence rarely announced itself. To many, he was barely there at all. His life revolved around a narrow world shared with his mother. After his parents separated, the household became inward-facing. She dedicated herself to him with a level of care that crossed into overprotection. She managed routines carefully. She adjusted her life to accommodate his sensitivities. From the outside, it looked like devotion. Inside, it became a sealed environment where isolation quietly deepened. Adam's days grew smaller. Physical movement through the world gave way to hours spent behind a screen. Communication shifted from spoken words to emails sent from the same house. Conversations became mediated through distance even when walls were shared. The outside world felt intrusive. The digital world felt controllable. Online spaces became his primary environment. He consumed information obsessively. He studied previous acts of mass harm not with curiosity, but fixation. Names, timelines, methods, reactions. Patterns replaced people. Tragedy became data. The internet did not challenge his isolation. It rewarded it. There was no dramatic turning point visible to those around him. No loud warning. No confrontation that forced change. Instead, there was a slow narrowing of perspective. A collapse inward. A mind turning over the same ideas without interruption or contradiction. His internal world became self-reinforcing. The final morning did not begin at the school. It began at home. A private act of irreversible violence ended the life of the person closest to him. From there, movement followed intention. He drove to a place that once represented safety in his own childhood. A school he had attended. A space tied to memory rather than threat. His appearance that morning was deliberate. Dark clothing. Controlled posture. He carried weapons that had been legally acquired. There was no manifesto left behind. No message meant to explain. Only action. The events inside the school unfolded with terrifying speed. Minutes compressed into chaos. Teachers attempted to shield children with their bodies. Classrooms became places of fear instead of learning. Lives were taken before comprehension could catch up. The sounds that filled the halls were not meant to exist there. The incident ended as abruptly as it began. Adam Lanza did not remain to be questioned. There would be no trial. No cross-examination. No moment where answers could be demanded. Silence followed violence. What remained was devastation. Families waiting for news that would never bring relief. First responders confronting scenes no one should witness. A nation struggling to understand how such harm could occur in a place designed to protect the youngest members of society. Investigators searched for meaning in fragments. Hard drives. Digital histories. Written notes that never formed a coherent explanation. There was no ideological statement. No declared motive. Only evidence of obsession, isolation, and preparation. Attention turned to access. The weapons used had been obtained legally. That fact ignited debate that spread far beyond the town. Questions about responsibility. About oversight. About how mental health and access to firearms intersect in ways that systems fail to address. The impact did not fade with time. It reshaped policy discussions. It altered school security across the country. Lockdown drills became routine. Entrances hardened. Innocence was replaced with vigilance. Out of grief emerged resolve. Families of victims transformed pain into advocacy. Sandy Hook Promise was formed not as a symbol of anger, but prevention. Its mission focused on identifying warning signs early, on educating communities to recognize isolation before it turns destructive. The original school building was eventually taken down. Not as an attempt to forget, but as an act of healing. A new structure rose in its place. Designed with safety and openness intertwined. A space meant to honor memory without being trapped by it. Sandy Hook became more than a location. It became a reference point. A line drawn through American history separating before and after. Every subsequent incident carried its shadow. Every conversation about school safety returned to that morning. There was no single cause that could be isolated and removed. No simple narrative that could make the outcome feel inevitable. Instead, the tragedy exposed how multiple failures can align. Silence mistaken for peace. Withdrawal mistaken for harmlessness. Warning signs scattered across systems that never spoke to one another. The story resists closure. It does not resolve neatly. It lingers because it forces an uncomfortable recognition that the most severe harm often grows quietly, unnoticed, until it is too late. As you reflect on this case, consider where responsibility truly begins and where intervention might have changed the outcome. In the next part, the focus shifts to a university campus where silence once again concealed a storm that would alter an entire nation. Part 2, Virginia Tech. The morning began like countless others on a college campus. Students moved between buildings with backpacks slung over one shoulder, eyes fixed on phones or lecture notes. The air carried the quiet urgency of classes about to start. Professors prepared slides. Coffee cups steamed in hands numb from the cold. Nothing felt extraordinary. Universities are places built on repetition and routine, and that routine creates a sense of safety that feels permanent. Sung Hui Cho existed within that landscape almost unnoticed. He was an immigrant who had arrived in the United States as a child, growing up in a household shaped by hard work and long hours. His parents ran a small business, focused on survival rather than attention. At home, silence was not alarming. It was practical. That silence followed him into school. Cho rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was barely audible. Teachers described his muteness not as shyness, but as something heavier, something locked. Classmates struggled to remember conversations with him because there were so few. He moved through hallways as if trying not to disturb the air around him. His isolation was not dramatic. It was quiet and complete. Inside writing classes, another version of him appeared. His assignments were filled with disturbing imagery. Violence surfaced repeatedly, stripped of context or empathy. The words unsettled those who read them. Professors debated how seriously to take what they were seeing. Creative expression often pushes boundaries, and no one wanted to mistake art for intent. Yet concern grew. Faculty members referred him to counseling. Meetings were scheduled. Recommendations were made. But follow-through was inconsistent. Cho attended sporadically. Systems designed to help relied on voluntary participation. There was no mechanism to ensure continuity. Each intervention existed in isolation, never forming a complete picture. On the morning everything changed, the first act took place inside a residence hall. It was brief and confusing. The incident appeared contained. Law enforcement responded, but without a clear suspect or understanding of what they were facing. The assumption was that the danger had passed. That assumption proved fatal. The campus returned to normal operations. Classes continued. Students remained unaware that the threat had not ended. No campus-wide warning was issued. No message disrupted the routine. The gap between the first incident and what followed became one of the most scrutinized moments in modern campus safety history. Cho used that time deliberately. He moved across campus toward an academic building. He carried weapons obtained legally, despite a documented history of mental health intervention. The systems meant to restrict access had not communicated with one another. Inside Norris Hall, the second phase unfolded with relentless speed. Classrooms turned into traps. Students and professors attempted to barricade doors with desks and bodies. Some tried to escape through windows. Others froze, uncertain which choice meant survival. The violence was intimate and immediate. There was no distance, no abstraction. When law enforcement entered the building, the incident had already ended. Cho did not surrender. He ended his own life before questions could be asked. Once again, the opportunity to understand motive vanished with the perpetrator. What followed was an unprecedented media revelation. Before the second attack, Cho had mailed a package to a major news organization. Inside were videos, photographs, and a manifesto-style message. In it, he framed himself as a victim of cruelty and injustice. He blamed society for his pain. The materials were disturbing not only for their content, but for the clarity of intent they revealed. The decision to release portions of that package ignited fierce debate. Some argued the public needed to understand his mindset. Others warned that broadcasting such material risked amplifying the very notoriety he sought. The question of media responsibility became inseparable from the tragedy itself. Investigations exposed systemic failure rather than individual oversight. Cho had been deemed mentally ill in earlier proceedings and ordered to receive outpatient treatment. That information never reached the databases used for background checks. Privacy protections and bureaucratic fragmentation created blind spots no one bridged. Virginia Tech faced lawsuits alleging failure to warn students after the first incident. Settlements acknowledged mistakes without assigning singular blame. The focus shifted from punishment to reform. Universities across the country re-evaluated emergency protocols. Out of the loss came structural change. Campus alert systems were redesigned to prioritize speed over certainty. Mental health records began to be managed with greater coordination, balancing privacy with public safety. Law enforcement training adapted to emphasize immediate response rather than perimeter containment. The campus community rebuilt itself slowly. Memorials were erected. Scholarships established. Annual vigils transformed grief into collective remembrance. Virginia Tech became known not only for what it endured, but for how it responded. Cho's story remains unsettling because it challenges comfortable narratives. There was no sudden snap. No single failure. Instead, there were fragments of concern scattered across institutions that never converged. Silence was mistaken for harmlessness. Isolation was normalized. Responsibility dissolved between systems. This case forces reflection on how many warning signs can exist without prompting decisive action. It asks whether prevention depends less on identifying dangerous individuals and more on repairing the gaps between those tasked with care. As you consider this chapter, ask yourself where the line should be drawn between privacy and protection. In the next part, the focus shifts to a high school in Florida, where ignored warnings would once again echo with irreversible consequence. Part 3, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Valentine's Day arrived wrapped in expectation. Cards exchanged hands. Hallways carried laughter and the restless energy of a school day nearing its end. For many students, the afternoon meant plans after class, small celebrations, moments of connection. Nothing in the air suggested that the day would become a permanent marker of loss. Nicholas Cruz had once walked those same hallways as a student. His life story had been unstable from the beginning. He was adopted as an infant, raised in a household that attempted to provide structure but struggled with its own limits. Loss followed early. His adoptive father passed away when Cruz was still a child. Years later, his mother died as well, leaving him without the only consistent figure in his life. Grief was not processed. It accumulated. From a young age, his behavior drew attention. Emotional volatility. Sudden outbursts. Difficulty following rules. Schools documented concerns. Disciplinary actions mounted. Transfers followed. Each change removed him further from stability and reinforced a sense of rejection. Support systems existed on paper, but consistency was absent. Intervention was fragmented. By the time he reached high school, his isolation was visible. Classmates described him as withdrawn and angry. Teachers noted fascination with weapons and violent imagery. His behavior triggered alarm often enough that it entered official records. Eventually, he was expelled from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. The separation did not resolve the underlying issues. It intensified them. Warnings accumulated beyond the school environment. Local law enforcement had been called to his home multiple times over the years. Reports referenced emotional distress and alarming behavior. Tips were submitted to federal authorities after troubling online posts surfaced. Each warning existed as an individual data point. None of them converged into decisive action. As he reached adulthood, access replaced restriction. He obtained a firearm legally. There were no barriers triggered by the warnings scattered across different agencies. The system treated each concern in isolation rather than as part of a pattern. On the afternoon of Valentine's Day, Cruz approached the campus. He entered through an area that lacked effective security. The timing was deliberate, chosen to coincide with dismissal. What followed unfolded in minutes, yet its impact stretched indefinitely. Students and staff sought shelter wherever possible. Confusion spread faster than understanding. When the incident ended, Cruz did not remain at the school. He discarded his weapon and blended into the surrounding area, moving among those fleeing. He walked to a nearby location and waited. Law enforcement arrested him later that day without resistance. Unlike many previous cases, he survived to face the consequences. The aftermath exposed the depth of institutional failure. Investigators traced the trail of ignored warnings. Each agency had seen part of the picture. No one had seen the whole. The realization intensified public outrage, not only at the individual responsible, but at the systems that allowed the situation to progress unchecked. The legal process unfolded under intense national scrutiny. Prosecutors pursued the most severe penalty available. The defense focused on Cruz's mental health history, emphasizing lifelong emotional disturbance and compounded trauma. Survivors and families of victims testified, recounting experiences that left courtrooms silent. Their words transformed abstract tragedy into personal reality. After lengthy deliberation, the jury rejected capital punishment and imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of release. The decision divided public opinion. Some saw it as insufficient. Others viewed it as an acknowledgement of the complex interplay between accountability and mental illness. For the families, the verdict closed a legal chapter but not the emotional one. The Parkland tragedy did not remain confined to the courtroom. Students who survived refused to be silent. They organized, spoke publicly, and demanded reform. March for Our Lives emerged as a movement led by those directly affected. Their message focused on prevention, responsibility, and the cost of inaction. Policy discussions followed. Red flag laws gained momentum, allowing temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed a threat after due process. Several states adopted measures aimed at closing the gaps that Parkland had exposed. The debate remained polarized, but change had entered the conversation. The school itself became a place of reflection and rebuilding. Parts of the campus were redesigned. Memorials honored those lost. Anniversaries transformed into moments of collective remembrance. Healing progressed unevenly, shaped by grief that resurfaced without warning. Parkland became more than a location. It became a symbol of what happens when warnings are documented but not acted upon. It challenged assumptions that danger always announces itself loudly. It showed that repeated signals, when ignored, can culminate in irreversible harm. Nicholas Cruz's story resists simplification. It is not a tale of sudden transformation. It is a record of prolonged instability intersecting with systemic failure. The tragedy forced a national reckoning with uncomfortable questions about responsibility, intervention, and the cost of waiting too long. As you think about this case, consider which warning should have been enough to change the outcome. In the next part, the focus moves to a small Texas town where response time, rather than warning signs, would define the tragedy that followed. Part 4, Robb Elementary School, Uvalde. Uvalde was the kind of town where routines felt permanent. Streets were familiar. Faces repeated themselves across generations. An elementary school stood not as a fortress but as a gathering place, decorated with children's artwork and the quiet confidence that nothing truly bad could happen there. Teachers knew families by name. Parents trusted doors would remain open. Salvador Ramos grew up on the edges of that trust. He was known as withdrawn, distant, often silent. Social connection did not come easily. Over time, isolation hardened into resentment. Online spaces became an outlet where anger surfaced more openly. Messages grew darker. Attention, even negative attention, appeared to hold value. The boundary between performance and intent blurred. As adulthood approached, access arrived without resistance. He purchased firearms legally shortly after reaching eligibility. There were no effective barriers. No mechanism that paused the process long enough to question trajectory or intent. The moment passed without intervention. The sequence that followed began at home. A violent act against a family member shattered any remaining separation between private turmoil and public consequence. From there, movement was direct. He drove toward the school, crashed nearby, and approached the building carrying weapons. A door stood open. The absence of a barrier mattered. Inside, classrooms filled with children and teachers became places of terror. Time compressed into unbearable stillness. Fear replaced routine. Lives were lost in moments that should never have existed. The harm was swift. The aftermath would stretch for years. Law enforcement arrived quickly, yet action stalled. Assumptions replaced assessment. The situation was misunderstood as static rather than ongoing. Officers waited. Minutes accumulated. Those minutes carried weight measured in lives. Confusion about authority and protocol created paralysis where urgency was required. When the situation finally ended, the devastation was complete. Families waited in agony for confirmation that would not bring relief. The town's identity fractured. What had been a place defined by familiarity became a symbol of failure and grief. The focus turned immediately to response. Questions overwhelmed every explanation offered. Why did time pass without entry? Why did communication fail? Why did training not translate into action? Investigations revealed breakdowns at multiple levels. No single individual carried full responsibility. The system itself had failed. A federal review examined the response in detail. Findings described poor coordination, unclear leadership, and a lack of decisive command. The conclusions were devastating not because they were complex, but because they were preventable. Protocols existed. They were not followed. The cost was irreversible. Public anger followed sorrow. Families demanded accountability. Officials faced scrutiny that extended beyond the town. The tragedy forced a broader conversation about readiness, training, and the obligation to act decisively when lives are at risk. At the national level, pressure resulted in legislative movement. Bipartisan Safer Communities Act became law, representing the most significant change in decades. The legislation strengthened background checks for young buyers, funded mental health programs, and supported school safety initiatives. It was not a solution that erased loss, but an acknowledgement that inaction carried consequences. The school itself did not return to normal. The building became a place of memorial rather than learning. Plans were made to replace it, not to erase memory, but to allow the community space to heal without being trapped inside trauma. Flowers, candles, and messages filled the area for months. Grief became public and shared. Uvalde exposed a truth that went beyond weapons or warning signs. It revealed how response can matter as much as prevention. Even when harm cannot be stopped at the first moment, decisive action can limit its reach. Delay transforms crisis into catastrophe. The story resists simplification. It is not only about one individual or one decision. It is about how systems respond under pressure, how authority functions in moments that demand clarity, and how hesitation carries consequences measured in lives rather than minutes. For the families, healing remains uneven. For the town, trust must be rebuilt deliberately. For the country, Uvalde stands as a reminder that safety depends not only on laws and policies, but on the courage to act when those policies are tested. As you reflect on this chapter, consider where responsibility truly lies when time itself becomes the deciding factor. In the next part, the focus moves back to a high school where two students changed how the world understands school violence forever. Part 5, Columbine High School. The morning arrived carrying no sense of importance. A suburban high school settled into routine, lockers slamming shut, students drifting toward classrooms, teachers preparing lessons they had taught many times before. April air moved gently across the campus. Nothing suggested that this day would fracture history and redefine fear inside schools across the world. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not strangers to the building. They were students who blended in just enough to avoid attention. On the surface, they appeared unremarkable. Yet beneath that surface lived two very different psychological worlds moving toward the same destructive outcome. Harris projected control. He was articulate, confident, and skilled at manipulation. His writings revealed grandiosity and a belief in superiority. He viewed others as lesser, obstacles rather than people. Rules were something to exploit, not respect. Anger fueled his sense of power, and power fed his anger in return. Klebold lived in contrast. He was inward, emotionally fragile, and consumed by self-loathing. His journals reflected despair rather than dominance. He did not see himself above others, but beneath them. Where Harris externalized hatred, Klebold internalized it. His thoughts circled around rejection, loneliness, and the desire to disappear. Separately, their trajectories might have remained contained. Together, they formed a closed system that magnified their darkest impulses. Their friendship became an echo chamber where resentment hardened into ideology. Each reinforced the other. Harris supplied direction and certainty. Klebold supplied emotional fuel. Doubt had no place inside that bond. Their planning unfolded over an extended period. This was not impulsive. It was methodical. They gathered weapons gradually. They constructed explosive devices intended to maximize destruction. They recorded video diaries later known as the basement tapes, speaking directly to an imagined future audience. In those recordings, they did not sound uncertain. They sounded resolved. What they envisioned was larger than a school attack. Their goal was spectacle. They wanted scale. They wanted to be remembered. The school was not the target. It was the stage. On the day itself, elements of the plan failed. Explosives placed in the cafeteria did not detonate. What was intended to cause mass casualties at once did not unfold as designed. In that sense, the plan collapsed. Yet the violence that followed still reshaped everything. They moved through the school, confronting students and staff at close range. Hallways became corridors of terror. Classrooms transformed into places of helplessness. The library became the center of fear. The attack unfolded over an extended period, long enough for confusion to spread beyond the building into the surrounding community. When law enforcement arrived, protocol dictated containment. Officers waited for specialized units. That delay would later be recognized as a critical failure. By the time police entered the building, Harris and Klebold had already ended their own lives. There was no arrest. No interrogation. No courtroom. Instead, there were questions without answers and grief without resolution. Investigators uncovered the depth of preparation left behind in homes, computers, and recordings. The extent of the planning stunned the public. The idea that two teenagers could orchestrate something so deliberate shattered assumptions about youth violence. Media coverage was relentless. Speculation filled gaps where facts were incomplete. Narratives formed quickly, often incorrectly. Myths about bullying, culture, and influence took hold. Over time, deeper analysis revealed a more complex picture, one that resisted simple explanations. Columbine changed law enforcement permanently. Response strategies shifted from containment to immediate engagement. Officers were trained to confront threats without waiting. That change was written in blood. It reshaped emergency response across the country. The cultural impact extended even further. Columbine became a reference point. Subsequent acts of school violence were measured against it. The names Harris and Klebold entered public consciousness in ways that troubled many, raising concerns about notoriety and imitation. Their desire to be remembered was fulfilled in the worst possible way. Schools transformed after Columbine. Security increased. Lockdown drills became normalized. Surveillance expanded. Yet beneath the physical changes lingered psychological ones. The assumption of safety inside schools was permanently altered. The tragedy also forced difficult conversations about mental health, alienation, and the dangers of closed social worlds. It highlighted how warning signs can appear fragmented and easy to dismiss when viewed in isolation. Violent fantasies. Disturbing creative work. Prior legal trouble. None alone seemed definitive. Together, they formed a pattern that was missed. Columbine did not offer closure. It offered a lesson written repeatedly in the years that followed. It showed how partnership can amplify harm. How grievance can evolve into ideology. How the desire for recognition can outweigh empathy entirely. More than decades later, its shadow remains. Not because it was the first, but because it rewrote the script. Every school response plan, every discussion about prevention, every debate about media coverage traces part of its lineage back to that day. As you consider this chapter, think about how easily anger can transform when it finds validation instead of challenge. In the next part, the focus shifts to a school where the warning signs were far quieter, and the outcome shocked even those who thought they knew the person responsible. Part 6, Santa Fe High School. Santa Fe was a small town where familiarity bred comfort. High school football games brought families together. Churches filled on weekends. Teachers often taught the children of people they once knew as students themselves. The high school sat at the center of that rhythm, a place associated with routine rather than fear. Demetrius Pagurtzis did not stand out. Classmates described him as quiet, polite, and reserved. He participated in school activities and attended church with his family. Teachers saw a student who followed rules and avoided trouble. There were no public confrontations. No dramatic outbursts that demanded attention. If danger was expected to announce itself loudly, Pagurtzis did not fit the image. Beneath that calm exterior, however, an inner world was forming that few had access to. He withdrew socially over time. His interests shifted toward dark symbols and violent imagery. Writings later recovered revealed fixation on death and resentment toward peers. These thoughts did not surface in obvious ways. They remained private, unchallenged, and uninterrupted. The weapons used in the attack did not come from outside the home. They belonged to his father. A shotgun and a revolver, legally owned and stored in a place that assumed trust. There were no alarms. No safeguards that prevented access. Familiarity replaced caution, and that assumption carried irreversible consequences. The morning of the attack began like any other school day. Students moved toward classrooms, greeting friends, preparing for lessons. Pagurtzis arrived wearing a long coat despite warm weather. Hidden beneath it were the weapons he had taken from home. He entered an art classroom and began firing without warning. What followed did not end quickly. The incident extended over a prolonged period, marked by confusion and fear. Students escaped through windows and back exits. Others hid in closets and storage rooms. Law enforcement arrived and engaged, but the situation did not conclude in the way many expected. Instead of ending his own life, Pagurtzis surrendered. He was taken into custody alive. That distinction mattered. It meant questions could be asked. It meant the legal system would have to confront how to process what had happened. It meant the community would face years of uncertainty rather than immediate closure. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered additional disturbing details. Explosive devices had been planted around the school, though none detonated. The presence of those devices revealed planning and intent rather than impulse. During questioning, Pagurtzis made statements that shocked many. He spoke about wanting his actions to be remembered. He described choosing certain targets and sparing others. The words intensified pain rather than explanation. Families searched for meaning in statements that offered none. There was no ideology that clarified motive. No grievance that justified harm. Only a young person articulating detachment from the reality of what he had done. That detachment became central to what followed. Mental health evaluations began. Specialists assessed his capacity to understand the charges against him and participate in his defense. The conclusion was consistent. He was found incompetent to stand trial due to severe mental illness. The legal process halted. Justice, as commonly understood, entered suspension. Years passed without resolution. Periodic evaluations reviewed his condition. Each review reinforced the same conclusion. He remained confined to a state psychiatric facility rather than a courtroom or prison. The families of victims were left in limbo, unable to witness accountability or closure. The legal system struggled with the implications. Holding a trial without competency violated fundamental principles. Releasing him was unthinkable. The case existed in a state of permanent pause. It exposed how systems designed for punishment falter when confronted with profound mental illness. Public debate followed. Questions surfaced about responsibility, firearm storage, and early intervention. Could warning signs have been detected earlier? Could access have been restricted? Could treatment have interrupted the trajectory? None of those questions carried answers that softened the outcome. Santa Fe High School reopened, but the space felt altered. The art room became a symbol rather than a classroom. Counselors remained on campus long after news cameras left. Memorials honored those who were lost. Names were spoken aloud to resist forgetting. The community responded with resilience rather than rage. Scholarships were created. Remembrance ceremonies became annual rituals. Yet beneath those efforts lay an enduring unease. The realization that danger did not arrive in a recognizable form lingered heavily. This case challenged assumptions about predictability. It disrupted the belief that extreme harm always comes from visibly troubled individuals. Pagurtsis had appeared ordinary. His inner collapse was silent. That silence proved devastating. The broader impact reached beyond Santa Fe. It reignited discussions about secure firearm storage in homes. It raised awareness about adolescent mental health care and the limits of school-based observation. It highlighted how legal systems can stall indefinitely when competency becomes an insurmountable barrier. Unlike many other cases, there was no verdict to reference. No sentence to debate. The absence of resolution became its own burden. Families carried grief without the punctuation of an ending. The story remained unfinished. Santa Fe stands as a reminder that prevention requires more than watching for obvious danger. It requires attention to quiet withdrawal. It demands systems capable of responding before isolation turns inward and explodes outward. As you reflect on this chapter, consider how many assumptions about normalcy shield warning signs from view. In the next part, the focus moves to a Michigan high school where the warnings were visible, documented, and still tragically ignored. Part 7, Oxford High School. Oxford was a town built on routine and familiarity. A close-knit community where schools were considered extensions of home rather than places of danger. The high school corridors carried the usual noise of students counting down to winter break. Teachers focused on exams, projects, and lesson plans. Nothing about that Tuesday morning suggested it would become a defining scar for the town. Ethan Crumbly had never been a loud presence. Teachers described him as quiet, intelligent, and withdrawn. To many classmates, he blended into the background, easily overlooked in crowded hallways. Yet in the days leading up to the tragedy, warning signs surfaced with unusual clarity. These were not subtle signals buried in hindsight. They were visible, documented, and discussed. Drawings appeared on his schoolwork. Images of weapons. Messages expressing despair and violent thoughts. Notes that referenced suffering and death. Teachers recognized the seriousness immediately. School administrators contacted his parents and requested a meeting. That meeting took place on the very morning of the attack. During the meeting, concerns were explained directly. The drawings were shown. The emotional distress was outlined. The recommendation was clear. Ethan should be taken home and evaluated. The situation required intervention. Yet that intervention never came. His parents declined to remove him from school. He returned to class. The moment passed. What made this case distinct was not the absence of warning, but the presence of it. The signs were not scattered across agencies or separated by years. They converged in one room, hours before violence erupted. The opportunity to interrupt the trajectory existed and slipped away. Shortly after, the sound of gunfire echoed through the building. Panic spread instantly. Students ran. Classrooms locked down. Teachers shielded those they could. The attack lasted only minutes, but the damage extended far beyond that brief window. Lives were lost. Others were forever altered. Ethan did not flee. He was taken into custody alive. The weapon used had been purchased days earlier by his father. Online, Ethan had referred to it as his new beauty. The language revealed fascination rather than fear. Access had been granted without restriction or supervision. The immediate aftermath left Oxford stunned. Questions emerged faster than answers. How could this happen after such clear warnings? Why was no decisive action taken? The investigation moved quickly, not only into the actions of Ethan, but into the role of those around him. Ethan was charged as an adult. The charges were severe. The legal system treated the act not as a juvenile mistake, but as intentional violence. In court, he pleaded guilty. There was no denial. No attempt to dispute responsibility. During sentencing, the judge emphasized the premeditated nature of the act and the devastation inflicted on the community. The sentence was unprecedented. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For a teenager, it marked one of the harshest outcomes possible. Supporters of the decision viewed it as accountability. Critics questioned whether such a sentence aligned with principles of rehabilitation. The debate reflected a broader tension between justice and mercy. Yet the case did not end there. For the first time in American history, the parents of a school shooter were charged with involuntary manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that James and Jennifer Crumbley had ignored obvious warning signs, failed to secure the firearm, and dismissed their responsibility to intervene. The trials drew national attention. Text messages, purchasing records, and testimony painted a picture of negligence rather than ignorance. The prosecution framed the parents not as distant observers, but as active enablers through inaction. The defense argued that parents could not be held responsible for the independent actions of their child. The verdicts changed legal precedent. Both parents were found guilty and sentenced to prison. The ruling sent shockwaves through the country. It redefined the conversation around parental responsibility, firearm storage, and accountability. The message was unmistakable. Warning signs impose obligation. Ignoring them carries consequences. For the Oxford community, healing moved slowly. Memorials honored the students who were lost. Their names were spoken repeatedly to resist abstraction. Classmates shared stories of bravery. Teachers were remembered for their efforts to protect others. The school worked to rebuild trust, knowing it could never return to what it once was. Nationally, the case reshaped policy discussions. Threat assessment protocols gained renewed emphasis. Schools reviewed how warnings were handled. Parents were confronted with a new reality in which negligence could cross into criminal liability. Conversations about mental health, gun access, and accountability became inseparable. Oxford demonstrated that tragedy does not always stem from hidden danger. Sometimes it grows in plain sight. Sometimes systems recognize risk but hesitate to act. Sometimes responsibility is deferred until it is too late to matter. The story remains unsettling because it removes distance. It shows how close prevention can be to failure. How a single decision, or refusal to decide, can alter countless lives. It forces a reckoning with the idea that awareness alone is not enough. Ethan Crumbley's case stands as one of the clearest examples of missed opportunity in modern school violence. The warnings were real. The timeline was short. The cost of inaction was immeasurable. As you reflect on this chapter, consider how responsibility shifts when danger is acknowledged but ignored. In the next part, the focus moves to a quiet Kentucky school where no one saw the warning signs at all, and the shock came from the person least expected. Part 8, Marshall County High School. Marshall County was the kind of place where expectations were built on familiarity. The high school served a rural community where teachers knew families well and students often grew up together from early childhood. Mornings unfolded predictably. Students gathered in common areas before the first bell, talking quietly, waiting for class to begin. The atmosphere carried no sense of danger. It felt ordinary in the way only routine can feel. Gabriel Parker fit comfortably inside that picture. He was considered a model student. Polite. Soft-spoken. Academically capable. Teachers described him as respectful and calm. He had no history of serious disciplinary trouble. His grades were solid. He showed interest in science and technology. Nothing about his behavior raised alarms. If someone had been asked to name a student least likely to cause harm, his name would have appeared near the top of the list. What no one saw was the inner world he kept entirely to himself. While his outward life appeared stable, his private thoughts moved in a very different direction. He did not announce distress. He did not seek attention. Instead, he withdrew inward quietly, building a plan without sharing it with anyone. There were no public warning signs. No dramatic shifts in behavior. Silence did the work of concealment. The preparation happened slowly and deliberately. He wrote privately. He imagined outcomes. He studied routines. This was not an impulsive act born of a single bad moment. It was a process that unfolded in isolation. The absence of visible distress made intervention impossible. There was nothing obvious to interrupt. On the morning everything changed, students gathered in a common area before class. Backpacks rested at their feet. Conversations drifted between topics as ordinary as homework and weekend plans. Within moments, that space transformed into confusion and fear. The incident was brief and chaotic. Panic spread instantly. Students ran. Some sought cover wherever they could. The event lasted only a short time, yet the shock it delivered was overwhelming. When it ended, the damage was already done. Young lives were lost. Others were left injured, physically and emotionally. The school that had felt so safe minutes earlier became unrecognizable. The speed of the event left little room for understanding what was happening until it was over. Law enforcement responded quickly and took Parker into custody alive. There was no attempt to flee. No resistance. The contrast between his calm demeanor afterward and the harm caused deep confusion. The community struggled to reconcile the image of the polite student they knew with the reality of his actions. As investigators searched for explanations, they found what had never been visible before. Private journals. Written thoughts. Reflections that revealed emotional detachment and a desire to experience chaos rather than escape it. The words were not fueled by rage or ideology. They were unsettling precisely because of their cold clarity. He described curiosity about what it would feel like to cause harm. The absence of empathy stood out starkly. There was no evidence of sustained bullying. No clear external trigger. No dramatic grievance that could be pointed to as cause. The lack of a familiar motive made the case even more disturbing. It suggested that danger does not always grow from visible suffering. Sometimes it develops quietly, unnoticed, in the absence of obvious pain. The legal process treated the act with gravity. Parker was charged as an adult despite his age. The evidence showed planning and intent. In court, the focus remained on accountability rather than speculation. Families of victims spoke directly about their loss. Their words carried the weight of a future erased. The sentence reflected that weight. A lengthy term of imprisonment was imposed, extending far beyond the span of his youth. For the community, the ruling offered a form of closure, but not peace. No sentence could restore what had been taken. It could only mark the seriousness of the harm. Marshall County faced the aftermath together. Counseling services expanded. Teachers and students worked through trauma that lingered long after the news cycle moved on. Memorials honored the students who were lost. Their names were spoken with care, ensuring they remained more than statistics. The case prompted renewed discussion about detection and prevention. How do schools identify danger when there are no visible signs? How do communities respond when a trusted image masks internal collapse? The answers were not clear. Training increased. Awareness campaigns followed. Yet uncertainty remained. This tragedy challenged a deeply held belief that violence announces itself through obvious distress or disruption. Parker had shown neither. His silence was complete. That silence proved devastating. Marshall County became a reminder that prevention requires more than reacting to warning signs. It requires systems capable of noticing absence as much as presence. The lack of conflict, the lack of expression, the lack of connection can matter just as much as visible struggle. For those who survived, the memory of that morning remains sharp. The sound of sudden chaos. The confusion. The realization that normal life can fracture without warning. The school continues to function, but it does so with an awareness that innocence once assumed cannot be fully reclaimed. As you reflect on this case, consider how easily trust can coexist with unseen danger. In the next part, the story moves to a school where the person responsible was loved, admired, and seemingly happy, making the outcome even harder to comprehend. Part 9, Marysville Pilchuck High School. Marysville Pilchuck was a school where belonging mattered. Spirit assemblies filled gyms. Homecoming was treated like a shared celebration rather than a competition. Students recognized one another across grades. Teachers spoke of pride in their community. It was a place where popularity and kindness often overlapped, where social bonds felt visible and reassuring. Jalen Freiberg embodied that image. He was well-known, well-liked, and admired by peers. A football player. A student connected to a respected tribal family. He smiled easily. Teachers described him as polite and engaged. Friends saw confidence rather than isolation. If danger was expected to wear the face of anger or alienation, Jalen did not resemble it. That perception masked a private struggle that few recognized in time. Beneath the outward ease, emotional pain had been building quietly. Relationships mattered deeply to him, perhaps more deeply than those around him realized. When bonds fractured, the impact was overwhelming. Romantic disappointment and conflict with close friends cut sharply. For someone whose identity was tied to connection, separation felt like collapse. In the days leading up to the incident, subtle signals appeared. Messages posted online hinted at heartbreak and distress. The tone shifted from lighthearted to heavy. To observers, it looked like the turbulence of adolescence. To Jalen, it felt like something far more final. The language suggested a narrowing of perspective, where pain eclipsed everything else. On the morning that changed everything, he reached out to a small group of friends. He invited them to sit together for lunch, framing it as a normal gathering. The cafeteria was filled with students talking and laughing, trays sliding across tables, the noise of routine life continuing uninterrupted. No one sensed the gravity of what was about to happen. When the moment arrived, it unfolded in seconds. Shock replaced familiarity. The space transformed instantly from communal to chaotic. Students scattered. Teachers reacted without understanding what they were seeing. Jalen did not move through the school. The harm remained contained to that single location, yet its impact rippled outward relentlessly. He did not attempt to escape. The incident ended with his own life lost at the scene. The abruptness left no opportunity for explanation or intervention. Once again, answers disappeared with the person who could have provided them. As the reality set in, the community faced a uniquely painful truth. The victims were not strangers. They were close friends and relatives, members of the same extended tribal network. Loss was layered. Families mourned multiple children at once. Grief spread through a community bound by history and kinship. The Tulalip tribes responded with collective strength. Vigils blended cultural tradition with shared mourning. Ceremonies honored both the lives lost and the values of unity and resilience. The language of healing emphasized togetherness rather than blame. The community chose to grieve publicly, refusing isolation. Investigators found no evidence of external influence or ideological motivation. There were no signs of organized extremism or long-term planning. The act appeared deeply personal, driven by emotional distress rather than hatred. That conclusion complicated public understanding. It challenged the assumption that violence always stems from rage or resentment. Sometimes it grows from despair. Attention turned to access. The firearm used had been taken from his father's home, where it had been legally owned. There was no indication that the weapon had been secured in a way that prevented access. That detail carried legal and moral weight. The legal process that followed focused not on the shooter, but on responsibility within the household. Jalen's father faced charges related to firearm storage. The case unfolded quietly, overshadowed by grief rather than outrage. When a sentence was handed down, it did not bring relief. It underscored the reality that accountability does not heal loss. The school itself underwent transformation. The cafeteria, once a symbol of trauma, was redesigned. Counselors remained available long after the immediate crisis passed. Students struggled with conflicting memories of joy and loss tied to the same faces. Healing did not follow a straight line. It arrived unevenly, shaped by remembrance and silence alike. Marysville Pilchuck became a case that resisted easy categorization. The shooter was not an outsider. He was embraced. He was celebrated. That contradiction forced a painful reckoning with the limits of perception. It revealed how suffering can remain invisible even in the most connected environments. This tragedy highlighted the fragility of emotional health during adolescence. It showed how quickly pain can escalate when coping mechanisms fail and support feels unreachable. It reminded communities that happiness displayed outwardly does not guarantee stability within. The broader conversation shifted toward emotional awareness rather than solely behavioral warning signs. Schools began to emphasize mental health resources and peer support. Discussions about checking in on those who seem fine gained urgency. The lesson was uncomfortable but necessary. Marysville Pilchuck stands as one of the most heartbreaking examples of how despair can hide behind smiles. It challenges the belief that being loved is always enough to protect someone from inner collapse. It reminds us that silence can exist even in the loudest rooms. As you think about this chapter, consider how often emotional pain goes unnoticed when it does not match expectations. In the next part, the story moves to a remote community where trauma, isolation, and loss converged long before the school doors were ever opened. Part 10, Red Lake Senior High School. Red Lake was a community shaped by distance and history. Located far from major cities, the reservation carried both cultural strength and deep isolation. Life moved at a slower pace, bound tightly by family ties, tradition, and shared memory. The school served not only as a place of learning, but as a center of daily life where students gathered under the weight of generations that came before them. Jeff Weiss grew up inside that isolation. His childhood was marked by loss that arrived too early and too often. His father, a tribal police officer, ended his own life when Jeff was still young. The event fractured any sense of stability. His mother later suffered a severe accident that left her unable to care for him. Jeff was raised by his grandfather, a respected elder, but the absence of parents left a quiet void that never closed. Grief did not pass through him cleanly. It settled. Over time, sadness hardened into detachment. He withdrew socially and struggled to connect with peers. School became a place of survival rather than belonging. Classmates later recalled him as reserved, sometimes distant, often alone. Bullying followed him, subtle but persistent, reinforcing a sense of exclusion that mirrored his losses at home. His inner world found expression online. Dark drawings. Disturbing messages. Fascination with violence and despair. These were not cries for attention in the conventional sense. They were fragments of a mind attempting to process trauma without guidance or support. Mental health care in the community was limited. Resources were scarce. Distance made access difficult. Intervention, when it came at all, arrived too late or too lightly. The day everything changed began outside the school. Violence erupted within the family first, collapsing the boundary between private pain and public consequence. From there, Jeff moved toward the place that symbolized his daily life. The school. The sequence unfolded quickly, leaving little room for understanding or prevention. Inside the building, fear replaced routine. Students and staff reacted instinctively, seeking safety wherever possible. The incident ended with Jeff's own life lost. Once again, answers vanished with the person at the center of the tragedy. There would be no explanation, no courtroom testimony, no narrative that made sense of what had happened. The aftermath struck the community with particular force. Red Lake was already carrying historical trauma. The loss of elders, students, and educators layered fresh grief onto wounds that had never fully healed. National attention arrived briefly, then moved on. For those left behind, the pain remained. Investigations pointed toward a familiar convergence. Untreated trauma. Isolation. Limited access to mental health care. Exposure to violence without tools to process it. There was no evidence of conspiracy or external influence. Only a young person overwhelmed by grief and anger that had nowhere to go. Federal agencies and tribal leaders acknowledged systemic failure. Calls were made for improved mental health services in indigenous communities. Suicide prevention programs were expanded. Counseling centers were established. These changes mattered, but they could not rewrite the past. Red Lake became a symbol not only of loss, but of resilience. Ceremonies honored the victims with an emphasis on healing rather than blame. Elders spoke openly about pain and recovery. The community chose remembrance as a form of resistance against silence. This case forced a broader reflection on inequality. Mental health struggles do not exist in isolation. They are shaped by access, history, and environment. When support systems fail repeatedly, consequences accumulate. Red Lake exposed how vulnerability increases when communities are left to carry trauma alone. Jeff Weiss's story does not fit a simple pattern. It is not driven by notoriety or ideology. It is rooted in grief compounded by neglect. It underscores the reality that prevention requires equity, presence, and sustained care, especially in places far from power and visibility. Red Lake remains a reminder that violence does not emerge from nowhere. It grows where pain is inherited, where help is distant, and where silence becomes the default response to suffering. As you sit with this final chapter, consider how differently these stories might have ended if support had arrived sooner, and share what lesson stayed with you the longest. This series ends here, but the questions it raises continue into every community willing to listen.